Officer John Smith had seen it all. With 20 years of experience on the force, he had become accustomed to the routine of handling criminals, often with a smug satisfaction that came with the job. But today was different. Today, he had just captured another criminal, or so he thought. Emily Harris, a confident black woman in a luxury car, had crossed the wrong officer. Smith was sure he was in control as he paraded her around the precinct, a smug grin on his face. His fellow officers watched in silence as he paraded her like a trophy, convinced of his victory. Smith was convinced that this was yet another easy win. A black woman driving a nice car? It was too easy. He mocked her, made her feel small, and relished the power he felt in that moment. He didn't care about the details, didn't bother to question why a woman like her might be driving such a car. All he saw was a target, a woman who he believed didn't belong in his world. But just as the smugness was settling in, Emily Harris, handcuffed and looking unfazed, did something unexpected. In a single, swift motion, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a leather badge holder. The shiny gold badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct. Smith's face drained of all color as he realized the shocking truth. "I'm Captain Sarah Johnson," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "Your new commanding officer." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The room fell silent. Smith stood frozen, his mind racing. How could this be? The woman he had just humiliated, the one he thought was beneath him, was now his superior. The power dynamic had completely flipped, and the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone, even Smith, knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger confrontation. What had seemed like a simple victory was quickly unraveling into the worst mistake of Smith's career. The room fell silent, the air thick with disbelief. Officer John Smith stood frozen, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of him. He had always prided himself on his authority, his confidence. But now it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. Captain Sarah Johnson, the same woman he had just humiliated, taunted, and paraded in front of his colleagues, was now his superior. The smug grin that had once plastered his face slowly faded, replaced by an expression of sheer panic. The precinct officers stood motionless, eyes darting between Smith and the woman who had just revealed her true identity. Some exchanged quick glances, others stared blankly, as if unable to comprehend what had just happened. Their faces mirrored the shock that rippled through Smith's entire being. Captain Johnson, the woman he had treated as nothing more than a criminal, was now in command of them all. Smith's stomach twisted into knots. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He tried to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. His throat tightened, his breath shallow. How could this be happening? How could the woman he had so easily targeted and mistreated, simply because of her race, now stand before him as his boss? The weight of his actions, the wrong he had done, was crashing down on him like a ton of bricks. What is this?" Smith stammered, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes flicked nervously between Captain Johnson and his fellow officers, hoping, praying, that someone would speak up, that someone would deny the truth. But there was no savior. No one came to his rescue. The truth was too glaring to ignore. The walls of the precinct felt like they were closing in on him. Captain Johnson didn't flinch, didn't waver. She stood tall, her presence commanding the room with a quiet but undeniable force. She didn't need to raise her voice to assert her authority. Her mere existence in that moment was enough to send a message. She had nothing to prove. She wasn't here to beg for respect. She was here to claim it, and nothing could stop her now. Smith felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His mind raced, scrambling for a way out, a way to undo the mess he had created. But there was no way back. He had crossed a line he never thought he would cross. And now he had to face the consequences. "Take off the cuffs," Captain Johnson said, her voice steady but cutting through the tension like a blade. The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. She didn't need to raise her voice to make it clear. Smith had no choice but to comply. Smith hesitated. His hands trembled as he reached for his belt, fumbling with the cuffs. The sound of the metal clicking open was deafening, echoing in the silence of the room. As the cuffs fell from Emily's wrists, the red marks left behind by the restraints stood out starkly against her dark skin, a painful reminder of the injustice she had suffered. But Emily didn't rub her wrists, didn't show any sign of weakness. She simply straightened her posture and met Smith's gaze, her eyes unwavering. She had endured his cruelty, his racism, but now she was the one in control. She didn't need to say anything more. Her presence alone was a testament to her strength. Her resolve. Smith's face flushed with embarrassment. His confidence, once so unshakable, was gone. The room felt suffocating, the weight of his shame pressing down on him with unbearable force. This wasn't just about losing his authority. This was about his entire career, his reputation, his identity as a police officer, collapsing in front of him. The officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do, unsure of where their loyalties now lay. The realization hit them all at once. Captain Johnson, the woman they had all seen as a criminal moments ago, was now their leader. And Smith, the man who had wronged her, was exposed for the coward he truly was. Smith's knees buckled slightly, and he had to brace himself against the desk to avoid collapsing. His mind swirled with panic, a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. There was no escape. Captain Sarah Johnson had taken back her power, and he was left to face the consequences of his actions. The silence in the room was deafening, heavy, and suffocating. Emily Harris, Captain Sarah Johnson, stood in front of Officer John Smith, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Yet she radiated a calm authority that sent an unsettling shiver down his spine. The air felt thick with tension, like a storm about to break, and every officer in the room seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. Smith's hands trembled slightly as he stood there, trying to steady himself, but his thoughts were a chaotic mess. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears, and for the first time in years, he felt a surge of fear. His mind screamed for him to regain control, to fix what had gone wrong, but he was paralyzed, frozen in place, trapped in his own guilt. Emily, or rather Captain Johnson, didn't look at him with anger. There was no rage in her eyes, no hint of the emotion that should have been there after what he had done. Instead, her gaze was cold, calculating, piercing through him like she could see every ounce of his weakness, and she wasn't going to let him off easy. "Take off the cuffs, Smith," she said, her voice calm and steady, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken commands. Her words sliced through the room, sharp and final. The officers around them shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking from one to the other, unsure of what to do next. They had witnessed the entire ordeal, the wrongful arrest, the mocking, the planting of evidence. And now they watched as Captain Johnson stood unshaken, demanding justice, Smith opened his mouth, but no words came. He could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs against his palms, the keys now seeming impossibly heavy. His body wanted to obey, to just release her from the cuffs, but his pride, his arrogance, was holding him back. Could he do it? Could he undo the damage he had caused? Or was it already too late for redemption? Emily's voice cut through his hesitation once more. Keeping me detained unlawfully will only add more charges to your record. Smith, I'd suggest you think about that before you make another mistake today. Her words landed like a punch to his gut. The reality of what she was saying hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. There was no way out now. He could feel the eyes of every officer on him, some filled with judgment, others with a quiet anticipation of what would come next. They were waiting for him to make the wrong move, to prove that he wasn't fit to be in the uniform he wore. His fingers fumbled with the keys, his mind racing with panic, but his body moved slowly, as if reluctant to admit the truth. With each second that passed, the weight of his actions pressed down harder on him. The silence in the room deepened, making the space feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in on him. Finally, with a shaky exhale, Smith inserted the key into the handcuffs and twisted it. The sound of the locks clicking open felt deafening, louder than it should have been in the quiet of the room. Emily flexed her wrists once the cuffs fell away, the red marks where they had dug into her skin standing out starkly against her dark complexion. She didn't rub them, didn't wince in pain. Instead, she looked at Smith with a gaze that was almost pitying, as if she knew the fate he had sealed for himself the moment he chose to arrest her unjustly. "You didn't even bother to ask, did you?" she said quietly, her voice soft but filled with an undeniable force. "You saw a black woman in a nice car, and that was enough for you. You didn't think twice before pulling me out of my vehicle. You didn't hesitate before planting evidence. You didn't even hesitate when you thought you could get away with it." Smith stood there, unable to respond. His throat was dry, his mouth felt like it was full of sand. What could he say? How could he justify what he had done? There were no excuses. Emily stepped closer, closing the distance between them. The tension in the room grew thicker, almost suffocating. Every officer in the room could feel it, the weight of what was happening, the knowledge that the injustice of the past was now being confronted head-on. "Now you're going to explain everything," Emily continued, her voice now a low, steady command. "But not to me." Her eyes flicked past him, to the officers standing around the room, their faces filled with a mix of shame, guilt, and uncertainty. "You're going to explain it to them." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Smith's knees felt weak. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He had to face the truth of his actions, and the room knew it. It was the moment of reckoning for both him and the system he had long been a part of. The confrontation had only just begun, and Smith could feel the walls closing in. The room was still, as if time itself had stopped. Every officer present, every set of eyes locked onto Emily Harris, Captain Sarah Johnson, as she took another step closer to Officer John Smith. The sound of her slow, deliberate movements echoed in the heavy silence. Her presence filled the room with an undeniable gravity, her every word now carrying the weight of truth, of years of injustice. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her gaze alone was enough to strip away the bravado Smith had clung to for so long. His bravado that had led him to wrongly arrest her, humiliate her, and abuse the power he once believed he controlled. Now she was the one in control, but it wasn't power she sought. No, this was something much more important. "Do you know what you did, Smith?" Emily's voice cut through the room, steady but cutting like a knife. "Do you know what you tried to do?" Smith opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He tried to shift his weight, to gather his thoughts, but all that filled his mind were the consequences of his actions. The cold realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. He had wronged her in ways he could never take back. He had wronged an entire system, a community, and the very badge he wore. Emily didn't wait for him to answer. She had no interest in his excuses. You saw a black woman in a luxury car, and you didn't hesitate. You assumed I didn't belong there, that I had to be a criminal. You didn't even think twice. Smith felt his chest tighten as the words hit him, each syllable like a dagger in his heart. He couldn't escape the truth. He had been blinded by his own prejudices, by the ugly beliefs that had seeped into his heart over the years. In his mind, she was just another statistic, another person who didn't fit into the narrow box he had created for the world around him. He had seen her, judged her, and sentenced her without a second thought. You didn't just arrest me, Smith, Emily continued, her voice now growing quieter but more powerful. You tried to destroy me. You planted evidence in my car. You tried to frame me because you thought I was beneath you, because you thought you could get away with it. The words were a punch to Smith's gut. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against his chest as if the weight of his own guilt was too much to bear. His breathing became shallow, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had no defense, no excuses. He had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone. Emily's eyes were locked on his, unwavering, and for a moment, Smith felt like he was drowning in them. You didn't see me as a person. You saw me as something less, something you could control, something you could break. But you were wrong. You were wrong, Smith. A lump formed in Smith's throat, and he swallowed hard, trying to keep the tears at bay. He had never been this vulnerable before. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on being the one in control. But now, standing before Emily, he felt small, insignificant. You were wrong to think you could silence me, Emily said, her voice firm but tinged with sorrow. You were wrong to think you could hurt me and walk away. I won't let you. Not this time. Not anymore. Smith's heart felt like it had dropped to the pit of his stomach. He couldn't look away. He couldn't move. He was trapped in the crushing weight of his own wrongdoing. Emily stepped back, her eyes still on him, but this time, there was a flicker of something else in her gaze. A strength, a power that came not from rage, but from the years of injustice she had endured. The years of people like Smith who had tried to break her. And yet, here she stood, unbroken, unbowed. I want you to explain your actions, Smith, Emily said, her voice steady and filled with an authority that could not be denied. Not to me, to them. She turned her gaze to the officers who had stood by, silent witnesses to Smith's abuse of power. The same officers who now knew the truth. Emily didn't have to say another word. They knew what she meant. You're going to explain everything to them, Smith. You're going to explain why you thought it was okay to treat me this way. Why you thought it was okay to destroy a life. Why you thought you could get away with it. The room was still, as the weight of her words settled in. The silence was thick, like a heavy fog, and Smith felt his world begin to crumble around him. He had lost everything, his authority, his pride, his belief in his own righteousness. But Emily, standing tall, unshaken, had gained something far greater. And in that moment, Smith understood that he would never be able to reclaim what he had lost. The truth had come for him, and there was no running from it. The night air was thick with tension as Smith stood over Emily, his hand still hovering near his holster. His voice, filled with a sense of false authority, cut through the air. Step out of the car, he barked, his tone demanding and cold. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't show fear, not a hint of submission. She just met his gaze with calm resolve, her expression unreadable that Smith's pulse quickened. I said step out, he repeated, his voice growing harsher. He was already so sure of his actions, so convinced that he could control this situation. After all, he had done it before. He had taken power away from others, manipulated them into submission. He had always walked away victorious, leaving his targets broken and silent. But this time was different. This time, Emily wasn't afraid. She wasn't backing down. Smith could see the calmness in her eyes, the steady breath she took, and it rattled him. She wasn't the criminal here. He was. Still, Smith pushed forward. He could feel the crowd gathering, officers slowly trickling into the scene, and the weight of their stares on him. But he refused to stop. This was his moment to control the narrative. If he couldn't get Emily to bend, then he'd make sure he created a story that would. He walked closer to her vehicle, his hand brushing against his belt, and for a split second, his fingers brushed over the plastic baggie that had been waiting in his pocket. His thoughts raced. This was his chance. The perfect setup. He knew he couldn't let her walk away, not when her presence challenged everything he had believed in for so long. He couldn't let her win. Smith pulled the bag from his pocket and, with a practiced motion, dropped it under the driver's seat. The small plastic bag sat there, innocently tucked away, waiting for anyone to find it. It was too easy. No one would question it. The officers around him, the witnesses, they were all just there to follow orders. They wouldn't think twice. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little drug situation here," Smith called out, his voice filled with false bravado, his smirk returning. He turned to the growing crowd of officers and bystanders, throwing out the accusation with an air of superiority, as if he had solved the case himself. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the reactions unfold around him. Shock, disbelief, and the familiar flicker of fear in their eyes. They wouldn't dare question him. Not here. Not now. But Emily wasn't backing down. Her eyes flickered down to the floor of the car, where the bag lay hidden under the seat. A flicker of realization crossed her face, but she didn't react. She didn't shout or make a scene. She stayed calm, like the storm that brewed quietly beneath the surface. She knew what Smith was trying to do. She could feel the weight of the lie he was weaving around her, the story he was creating, but she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. "That's not mine," Emily said, her voice clear and unwavering, each word like a strike to Smith's already shaky confidence. She didn't raise her voice, didn't scream or argue. She just stated the truth, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Smith's grin faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly regained control, his face hardening as he turned back to the crowd, already anticipating the moment when they would take his side. Well, he sneered. "That's a nice story, but I'm afraid that's not going to save you this time." He stood tall, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, forcing the narrative he had constructed onto the crowd. The onlookers, some already pulling out their phones, began murmuring, the whispers of disbelief turning into a steady buzz. Smith's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that what was supposed to be a clean arrest was starting to spiral out of his control. And yet, it still felt like he had the upper hand. At least that's what he wanted to believe. Emily's calmness, her refusal to bend, only served to unsettle him further. He had expected her to panic, to beg for mercy, to break under the pressure. But Emily wasn't just standing there. She was taking control of the situation, flipping the power dynamic in ways Smith could never have predicted. "This is harassment," Emily said, her voice steady, not a hint of fear. "You're making up charges to cover up your own mistake. This is wrong." Smith's mind raced. He had to act fast. He had already planted the evidence, already made the claim. He couldn't let it all fall apart now. But the doubt was creeping in, making his hands shake and his thoughts scatter. He could feel the walls closing in as more officers gathered, their faces twisted in confusion, some wary, others uncertain. Smith's mask began to crack. The crowd was no longer just passive onlookers, they were witnesses, and Emily knew it. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was exposing the lie for everyone to see. Smith could feel his world crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Officer John Smith, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief, stood tall in front of Emily. He tried to muster his authority, to convince himself that he was still in control, but it was slipping through his fingers. He had crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. His eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd, the bystanders who had begun to take out their phones, capturing the unfolding drama. This was spiraling out of his grasp. And then there was Emily, Captain Sarah Johnson. Still calm, still composed, despite everything that had happened, despite the humiliation, despite the false charges, despite the injustice being shoved down her throat at the hands of someone who had no business being in a uniform. She stood there, handcuffed for far too long, but her expression remained unchanged. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She wasn't broken. Smith's eyes narrowed as he tried to provoke her, trying to get her to crack. You're just going to stand there? You're not going to fight back? Not going to beg for mercy? His voice was mocking now, desperate. But Emily didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or react with anger. She simply stood tall, her posture unwavering, her eyes never leaving his. The calmness in her demeanor unsettled him more than any outburst ever could. Why should I fight? Emily said quietly, her voice steady and filled with an almost serene strength. Fighting you would only make you believe you had the power to break me. But you don't. She paused, letting the words settle in the space between them, thick with meaning. I'm not here to prove anything to you, Smith. I'm here to show everyone the truth. Her words hit Smith like a punch to the gut. He felt the air leave his lungs, the smugness he had carried for so long suddenly feeling hollow. The audience around them was no longer just watching. They were witnessing the collapse of his narrative, the shattering of the lie he had been trying to build. And in that moment, he realized how small he had become. Emily wasn't just standing her ground. She was turning his actions against him, and the more he tried to push, the more he exposed himself. Smith could feel his control slipping further, but there was one thing he could still hold on to, the story. He had to make it his story. You think they'll believe you? He spat, a desperate edge creeping into his voice. After everything I've done? After I've caught you red-handed? His words were hollow, echoing with a thinly veiled panic, but he couldn't stop himself. The doubt was spreading, and it was making him frantic. Emily's eyes softened, but her gaze remained firm. She looked almost pitying, but there was no malice in her expression. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She simply understood that losing her temper would play right into his hands. It would confirm the very thing he wanted to believe, that she was just another victim to be silenced. But she was no victim. She would not give him the satisfaction. I don't need you to believe me, Emily said calmly, her voice steady, unwavering. I just need them to see the truth. The truth you tried to hide with lies, with manipulation, with power. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting the others in the room. The officers who had once respected Smith now looked at him with uncertainty, some with disappointment. Smith's stomach churned. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. They were watching him now, not just for his actions, but for the man he was. And with every word Emily spoke, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. He wasn't the hero in this story. He wasn't the one in control. The truth was out, and all the anger, all the rage, and all the defiance that Smith had tried to hold on to were suddenly useless. He had crossed a line, and Emily had shown him, without raising a finger, that the power was never his to begin with. You've already lost, Smith. Emily's voice was soft, but her words carried the weight of 1,000 years of injustice. And you'll have to live with that. Smith stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the full weight of the consequences he had brought upon himself. There was no turning back now. There was nothing left but the truth, staring him in the face, and the realization that everything he thought he knew about power, about justice, had been a lie. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the silent room as Deputy Chief David Owens made his way toward the center of the precinct. His presence was commanding, not because of his title, but because of the quiet authority he exuded. He had been standing in the back, watching, waiting for the moment when things would tip. And now, as he stepped forward, every officer in the room seemed to brace themselves. The air felt charged with tension, thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. Smith's eyes flicked toward Owens, and for the first time, he felt a deep sense of unease. His confidence, the one thing that had held him together for so long, began to falter. The room that had once felt like his domain, a place where his word had been law, now felt like a cage. David, he tried to say, his voice hoarse, but the words seemed hollow. He wanted to explain, to justify himself, but the reality of what had been laid bare was undeniable. "Officer Smith." Owen's voice was calm, yet there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down Smith's spine. "We need to talk." His words carried a weight that was both comforting and terrifying at the same time. Comforting because Owens was a voice of reason in a moment that had spiraled out of control, but terrifying because Smith knew this conversation would mark the end of everything he had ever worked for. The other officers stood frozen, watching as the truth began to sink in. For so long they had followed Smith, trusted him, looked to him for guidance. But now, as the consequences of his actions unfolded before their eyes, doubt started to creep into their minds. The unspoken questions that had been lingering in the air, the ones they had ignored or justified, were now impossible to ignore. "You planted evidence." One officer, Sergeant Morales, finally spoke up. His voice was tight with disbelief, yet there was no mistaking the sting of accusation in his words. "You framed her, Smith. You used your position to destroy someone's life." His eyes locked onto Smith's, and the betrayal was clear. The trust that had once been there had been shattered in an instant. Smith's stomach dropped. He couldn't look away from Morales. The man who had once stood by him, the one officer who had respected him, now saw him for what he truly was. "It's not what it looks like," Smith tried to explain, but the words felt weak, empty. He could feel the walls closing in, the truth pressing down on him with crushing weight. The other officers exchanged uncertain glances, murmurs rippling through the room. Some couldn't meet his eyes. Others looked at him with disgust. Smith had been the embodiment of authority, the one they had all admired, but now, as they saw the depths of his wrongdoing, that admiration turned to shame. He had betrayed them all. "You were supposed to protect people," Owen said, his voice low, yet full of disappointment. "But instead, you used your power to tear them down. You took someone's dignity, their freedom, and you tried to destroy it." Smith's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to deny it, to fight back against the accusations. But the truth was there, glaring at him in the form of Emily standing tall, unfazed. Her unwavering strength, her refusal to let him break her, was a testament to everything he had done wrong. She had fought back without raising a fist, without anger. She had fought back with truth. "You've crossed a line, Smith," Owens continued, his eyes now hardening. "And now you have to face the consequences." For the first time, Smith felt small. His body trembled, his mind racing. But there was no escape from what had already been set in motion. He had thought he could control this situation. He had thought he could manipulate the narrative, make it his own. But the truth had come for him, and there was no denying it now. "You're suspended," Owen said, his voice cutting through the room like a gavel. The words were a death sentence to everything Smith had worked for. His career, his reputation, everything he had once believed in had been reduced to nothing. He was no longer a respected officer. He was just a man who had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He was the one who had failed the very system he had sworn to protect. As Smith stood there, his shoulders slumped, the reality of his downfall settling over him like a heavy fog. He couldn't bring himself to meet anyone's eyes. The faces of his fellow officers, the ones he had once stood beside, now seemed like a distant memory. He had lost their respect, their trust, and he knew that, deep down, he had lost something far more important, his sense of self. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But the apology felt empty, like words spoken into the void. It was too late for apologies. The damage had been done, and no amount of regret could fix it now. The truth had taken everything from him. And now, standing on the precipice of his destruction, Smith knew there was no turning back. The room was suffocating, heavy with the weight of truth that had been unfolding piece by piece. Officer John Smith, once a figure of authority, now stood at the center of his own unraveling. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting an almost surreal glow over the faces of the officers who had witnessed his every move. Every eye was on him, watching as the pieces of his carefully constructed world crumbled. He had tried to control the narrative. He had tried to frame Emily, tried to manipulate the situation to his favor. But no matter how hard he pushed, no matter how many lies he told, Emily remained unbroken, her composure unshaken. The room, the officers, the growing crowd, everything was pressing in on him, suffocating him. He had failed, and now the full weight of his actions was coming down like a hammer. It was Emily who broke the silence. "Take off the cuffs, Smith," she commanded, her voice steady and authoritative, yet carrying an edge that sent a ripple through the room. Smith froze. The keys dangled from his belt, and he could feel the cold metal pressing against his fingers. But for the first time, the action of unlocking the handcuffs felt like an insurmountable task. The cuffs had been his symbol of control, his way of asserting dominance. Now, they felt like the last shackle binding him to his past, to the man he had once believed himself to be. What do you mean?" Smith stammered, his voice betraying the uncertainty rising in his chest. The crowd of officers stood silent, watching him, waiting for his next move. His legs felt weak, his hands trembling. He tried to hold onto the last shred of his pride, but the truth was overwhelming him. Emily stepped closer, her gaze unwavering, the calm strength in her eyes only amplifying the panic inside him. "You heard me," she said, her words cutting through the room like a blade. "You will release me from these cuffs." The words hit Smith like a ton of bricks. His throat tightened, his mind raced. There was no way this was happening. Not like this. You're not supposed to be," he faltered. He had no words left. "I am Captain Sarah Johnson," Emily said, her voice ringing with undeniable authority. Her words were not just a revelation. They were a declaration. "And you have no choice but to obey my orders." The room seemed to stop in its tracks. Smith's body stiffened, as if the realization had hit him all at once, crashing through the walls he had built. Captain Johnson, the woman he had humiliated, belittled, and tried to destroy, was now his superior. The truth was standing right in front of him, too stark, too raw for him to deny any longer. The officers around him shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others staring at the ground. The weight of what Emily had just said, of what Smith had done, was heavy on their shoulders as well. You planted evidence in my car," Emily continued, her voice still calm but filled with the power of the truth. "You tried to ruin my life, all because of the color of my skin. And now you will release me." Smith's hands shook as he reached for the cuffs. He had no choice. The power that Emily wielded was no longer something he could ignore. The magnitude of what he had done, of the damage he had caused, was becoming clear. This wasn't just about his career anymore. This was about his very integrity, his soul. Everything he had believed in, everything he had stood for, had been shattered in an instant. The sound of the cuffs clicking open echoed through the room like a final judgment. As they fell away from her wrists, Emily flexed her hands, the red marks left behind standing in stark contrast to her dark skin. But she didn't rub them. She didn't show pain. Instead, she simply stood tall, unwavering, the picture of strength in the face of everything Smith had thrown at her. Smith felt like he was sinking. The air in the room was thick, and his body felt heavy, as if every ounce of his energy had been drained from him. He had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable than in that moment. His actions, his arrogance, his pride, all of it had led him here to this professional disaster. And now he was facing the consequences of his choices. "You tried to break me," Emily said softly, but her words were filled with the strength of everything she had endured. "But now the tables have turned, and I'm the one in charge." Smith stood there, unable to respond. The magnitude of his mistake was sinking in, each second stretching into eternity. "You were never in control," Emily continued, her gaze locking onto his, unflinching. "Not of me, and certainly not of this." The weight of those words pressed down on him like a stone. He had lost everything. His reputation, his career, his dignity, all of it was gone. And as the last piece of his world crumbled away, Smith understood, finally, that Captain Sarah Johnson had not only unmasked the truth, she had unmasked him. The sound of the door slamming behind him was deafening. It marked the end of everything Smith had known, everything he had worked for. Officer John Smith was no longer a part of the precinct. He was no longer a part of the brotherhood he had once been so proud of. The weight of the decision to relieve him of duty hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Deputy Chief Owen's words still echoed in Smith's mind, a constant reminder of his fall from grace. "Officer Smith, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately." The finality in Owen's voice was undeniable, and as the words sunk in, Smith felt like the world had stopped. There was no way to undo the damage he had caused. His career, his reputation, the respect of his fellow officers. All of it had been shattered in an instant. He walked out of the precinct, his back hunched, his head low, the shame too heavy to bear. The officers around him, the ones who had once stood by his side, no longer looked at him with admiration. Now, there was only a growing sense of disapproval, a quiet judgment that weighed on him with each step. Some turned their heads as he passed, others watched with distant eyes, their faces unreadable. But it didn't matter. They had seen the truth. They had seen the man he truly was. And nothing would ever change that. In the moments that followed, it was clear that Captain Sarah Johnson, the woman he had tried to destroy, was now in charge. She stood tall in the middle of the room, the weight of the precinct's future resting on her shoulders. Her presence was like a beacon, a powerful symbol of everything the department had lacked for so long. In the face of all the injustice, the corruption, and the power struggles, she was unshaken. The officers, once loyal to Smith, now turned their attention to her. There was no question in their eyes anymore. The respect that had once been reserved for Smith now belonged to Emily. She had shown them all what true strength, leadership, and integrity looked like. She had confronted the darkness that had plagued their precinct, and with one quiet, resolute stand, she had taken it down. Emily's eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of the officers who had witnessed everything unfold. Some looked at her with hope, others with uncertainty, but all of them felt the shift in the air. There was no turning back. The change was here. "We start fresh," Emily said, her voice firm but filled with compassion. "There's no place for corruption, no place for those who think they can break others. We're here to protect and serve, and we will do that with integrity, with honor. No one is above the law, not me and not any of you." Her words were a promise, a vow to bring justice back to the precinct. They weren't just words. They were a vision for the future. A future where the officers could once again feel proud of their roles, where the community could trust them, Smith's departure was a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire precinct. His fall had opened the door to something new, something better. Emily had stepped into her role, not as a woman out for revenge, but as a leader, a symbol of change that could never be undone. And as Smith walked out, the precinct knew that the real work was just beginning. It would not be easy. There would be resistance, there would be struggles. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope. And with that hope came the certainty that things would never be the same. Captain Sarah Johnson had arrived, and the future of the precinct had changed forever. The precinct had fallen silent, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick with the weight of the change that had just begun. Captain Sarah Johnson stood at the center of the room. A new authority settled over her shoulders like a mantle, heavy yet resolute. Her rise to power wasn't a victory. It was the beginning of a much longer journey. A journey that would reshape everything the precinct stood for. The officers around her felt the shift, but none more so than Officer John Smith, now a shadow of the man he once was. The reality of his actions had crashed into him with all the force of a freight train. His pride, his career, his very sense of self had been shattered, but the consequences of his racist actions were just beginning to unfold. It wasn't just about losing his job. He had lost something far more significant. His humanity. His understanding of what it truly meant to serve and protect was irreparably warped, and now he would have to face the consequences of his choices. Emily's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the officers who had witnessed the unraveling of Smith. Some were still processing the truth, others felt the sting of betrayal, but all of them knew that things would never go back to the way they were. Smith's fall had exposed the darkness that had been lurking in their precinct for far too long. But Emily knew that this wasn't enough. Removing Smith, stripping him of his badge. It was just the beginning. The corruption that had festered within the department ran much deeper than one man. The rot had spread through the system, infecting everything from the bottom up. "This doesn't end here," Emily said, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of a future she knew would be fraught with resistance. "This is just the first step in a long battle." Her words weren't just a warning. They were a promise. The officers who had once turned a blind eye, who had stood by as Smith perpetuated his lies, now looked to Emily for guidance. She wasn't just their captain. She was the embodiment of the change they needed, even if they weren't ready for it. Some of them had sworn to uphold the law, but their actions had told a different story. Now, Emily was asking them to choose. Would they be part of the solution? Or would they remain complicit in the corruption that had poisoned their department? Smith's voice, once filled with smug confidence, now faltered as he stood in front of Emily, defeated. "You can't change everything," he spat, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. "This place, this whole system, it's too broken." Emily met his gaze, unwavering. "You're right about one thing," she said, her words deliberate, every syllable heavy with meaning. "It's broken, but it's not beyond repair, and I'm going to fix it, one step at a time." Smith stood there, speechless, as the full weight of her words sank in. The world he had once known was crumbling around him, and there was nothing left for him to hold on to. The corruption, the power he had wielded. It was all slipping through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but the cold realization that he had played a part in destroying something greater than himself. But for Emily, the real battle was just beginning. The struggle against corruption, against a system that had allowed men like Smith to thrive, that fight would take everything she had. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be battles ahead, enemies both inside and outside the precinct, and every victory would come at a cost. But Emily was ready. "Change will come," she said, her voice resolute, her presence commanding the room. "But it will take time, and it will take all of us." The precinct had already begun to shift, and Emily knew the hardest part was still to come. There would be those who resisted, those who fought to hold onto the old ways. But she would face them all, no matter what. Because this was her reckoning, and she wasn't going to back down.